America had vast problems of its own, dealing with the economic chaos of the Great Depression and the Wall Street crash. It was chaos that affected industry and agriculture alike, causing mass unemployment and huge internal movements of population. It was a time of civil unrest, with mass protests before the White House. General Douglas MacArthur earned himself a different niche in history, as he commanded U.S. troops to prepare to fire on U.S. citizens. A bizarre side street of history is that in 1930, many serious strategic thinkers and military experts thought that if any major war were to break out in the world in the next 10 years, it would most likely be contested between the United States and Great Britain. The isolationism of the U.S. was traditional in a society 2 oceans away from the rest of the world. In 1932, a new type of politics came to power in America with the election of Democrat Franklin Roosevelt.
It looks, my friends, like a real landslide this time.
In the New Deal, American interests were ever more closely focused on affairs at home and not across the seas. America was, in fact, to become the most deadly enemy of Hitler in the coming war. The underestimation of America was the Nazi dictator's greatest mistake. America was held by Hitler to be a country of no threat, racially weak, dominated by Jews, contaminated by its African-American population. The isolationism of the United States was reflected in its military strength. The USA could threaten no nation in the 1930s. While Germany thought the restricted 100,000-man army an insult, the United States Army was freely kept by Congress at around 135,000. Weak forces meant the views of the USA, even had she chosen to speak, would have been of little import. In 1935, Congress reinforced the wall against the world by passing the Neutrality Acts. These laws were the products of a conspiracy theory that U.S. arms manufacturers had engineered America's entry to the First World War. The new laws prevented U.S. arms sales to any nation at war. If Hitler paid little interest in the USA, across another ocean, the Empire of Japan viewed America with envy and aggression. The place of Japan and China in the build-up to the outbreak of war is often neglected. On the other side of the world, great movements of people and ideas were unfolding, acts perpetrated involving astounding cruelty and inhumanity. Huge conspiracies and war plans were forming in Japan. In 1926, a new emperor ascended the chrysanthemum throne, Hirohito. As was and remains the custom, a name was chosen for the era of the new monarch's reign. This was to be the Showa, the era of illustrious peace. The coming years were to bring anything but peace to the peoples of Japan and Asia. In the interwar years, Japan's miraculous transformation into a modern society seemed to be failing. There was economic depression, high unemployment, and rural poverty. Japan had sided with the victorious powers in World War I, yet gained little from the peace. The abandonment of democracy by European states, such as Italy and Germany, seemed to hint to some Japanese that they too should abandon the foreign ideas and return to a traditional society. Expansion from the crowded Japanese islands, islands that lacked the resources needed to power a modern industrial society, seemed a way out of the problems of recession and unemployment. Japan eyed China covetously, resenting European powers exploiting the wealth of the region. Japan came to be allied with the fascist powers, but was not a fascist country. Economic need and greed were integrated with a traditional mythology to create a unique worldview. Japanese society at all levels between the wars became permeated with an ideology of Japanese racial superiority, the God Emperor giving the Japanese race a distinction over other peoples who had lost their link with the divine. This ideology saw a future war in which enlightened Japanese liberated the less fortunate of Asia, and a war of world domination that would be fought against the United States. As a developed industrial country, Japan shared in the industrialized nation's exploitation of China. Various treaties had allowed these countries concessions of territory inside China, with the right to station troops. The British territory of Hong Kong was the model. From this presence, Japan planned to expand. In 1931, Japan had faked an attack by Chinese troops upon Japanese forces in Manchuria. In retaliation, the Army of Japan invaded and conquered the Chinese province, renaming it Manchukuo, and installing a puppet government headed by the last emperor of China, Puyi. With this vindication of their aggressive expansionist policy, the military gained more power, becoming the dominant force of Japanese policy. The invasion of Manchuria is a major landmark on the timeline to war. It was the first blow in the death of 1,000 cuts that was inflicted upon the League of Nations. A whole year after the Japanese completed their conquest, the League issued a report, carefully and worthily written, that condemned Japan's action. Nothing happened. Japan left the League. This was a whole year before Hitler's rise to power. In November 1936, fearful of Russian communist ambition in the Far East, Japan formed a pact with Germany and Italy, the Anti-Comintern Pact, directed against communist expansion. This was not a relationship of great trust or shared ideology, more of expedience and fear of a common enemy. Japan knew that Nazism's white supremacism could never be reconciled with their own racial supremacy. In 1937, full war broke out between China and Japan. The reason again, a faked attack by China upon Japanese troops. The Chinese, led by the aggressive Chiang Kai-shek, fought back. The war was to be long and vicious from the very start. In December 1937, the Chinese capital of Nanking fell. As many as perhaps as 1/3 of a million Chinese were killed in an orgy of murder, rape, torture, and looting. In 1937, 1/2 of the World War had already begun. Chinese historians believe this was the start of World War II. Stalin's Russia seemed the exception in a Europe full of states that had some grievance at the end of World War I. Russia's interest in international affairs was cautious and pragmatic, designed mainly to ensure no great coalition of capitalism was formed against Bolshevism. This was the time of the mass industrialization of the Soviet Union, of the 5-year plans. These years were the years of the purges. Every Russian, including Stalin, living in paranoid terror, fearing the enemy at home, and dreading betrayal, denunciation, imprisonment in a labor camp, or summary execution. Millions were to die and disappear. Of course, in the despotic terror of Stalinism lay a fearful dilemma for the democracies, which explains much of what has come to be called appeasement. In the 1930s, who was worse, Hitler or Stalin? To Western Europe, Bolshevism seemed far the greater evil, and Hitler at least a stern anti-communist. The actions of the politicians who wore suits, the Democrats who faced Hitler, are the counterparts to Nazi aggression. The mythic history of the war can